2017, last year, my summer project was something, there will be very little cyber in this talk. So just to introduce, last summer my project was to something that historians, at least I find very exciting. I took the entire CIA archive that is publicly on their website, and we're looking at approximately 600 gigabytes of PDF files. And I was working with the archive a lot for my book, and I was so annoyed that the OCRing of the PDF files is really bad, and the search interface that they have is also very bad. So it was practically unusable, the archive. So I decided to download the whole thing and re-OCR it. And now I have this amazing search tool into the CIA archive that allows me to pull out information on very specific operations in a highly targeted and very productive way. So what you see, what I will present today is sort of completely fresh historical research that used a little bit of that capability, but mainly other sources. Most of them open, but not all of them. So let me pull up my slide. Sorry. The operation that I'm going to present is a vintage operation. It took place in 1959, 1960. And there's a little bit of a technical component to it at the end. But basically, the question is, what I'm doing is I'm going to attribute or explain the attribution of one of the most extraordinary and most damaging active measures of all time. It's truly an absolutely stunning operation. And the fact that most likely, in fact, I'd be really curious whether that is correct, but most likely nobody in this room has ever heard of this operation before, shows you how successful it was. It doesn't really have a code name, and we don't know its actual code name. It's a KGB operation, so let's call it Operation Swastika. And as I said, it started in 1959 on Christmas Day. But I'll walk you through the operation in great detail in just a moment. So quick questions for today. What happened? How did the attribution work? How good was the evidence? The old question that comes up again and again. And especially, what did we learn from this case? Because in some cases, this is very much a Back to the Future type scenario, and I think you'll find out why in just a moment. So the story starts in September 1959, actually a few months earlier, but we don't know this yet. This is a picture of the synagogue in Cologne, Germany. The synagogue had just been reopened. It was reopened in September by the chancellor, by the German chancellor at the time, Konrad Adenauer, in a bit of vintage dress here, giving the opening speech in the synagogue. That was a huge event, sort of front page news all over the country. Because, you know, obviously this is 14, 15 years after the end of World War II and after the Holocaust. So this is a very important part of Germany coming to terms with its own very dark past here. 2 months later, on Christmas Day, 1959, a student walks home after a night out, Christmas Mass and a few drinks, and he walks past the synagogue in the middle of the night and discovers this. He discovers swastikas smeared on the walls of the synagogue, and, you know, Juden raus, Jews out. An anti-Semitic incident in a very high-profile locale that had just been reopened by the chancellor. And of course, Cologne and the entire country react immediately. This becomes, again, front-page news in every newspaper across the entire country. The following day, there's another incident in Cologne, and then a day later, more incidents pop up in different German cities. And over the course of 6 weeks, until mid-February, we count only inside West Germany 833 anti-Semitic incidents. 833. That is letters sent to Jewish business people or Jewish just individuals, swastikas, hate slogans, etc. And this is a map that one of the newspapers published at the time of all the incidents happening in Germany. Some of you will notice that it extends beyond Germany, and indeed, we see, smear graffitis like this pop up all across Europe, and in fact, across the entire planet. Let's just quickly go back. The operation extends, or the smearings show up as far away as Melbourne, Rhodesia, across the United States in 13 different cities, in the UK, in France, in almost every single European country. The government in Bonn, this is a picture of Bonn at the time, came up, even did a timeline analysis and came up with a bunch of statistics just to understand what was going on. And here we can see the 833 incidents over time. They peaked around January 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, actually in different countries. So some people at the time already suspected that this is moving so quickly. And it's such a global phenomenon. And in many countries, the slogans that showed up at walls were actually in German. So you would have, Juden raus printed in German on synagogues in New York and Australia, which was a little bit suspicious. Why suddenly in German everywhere? So here are a few pictures from New York at the time, early 1960. This is the Temple Emmanuel on Fifth Avenue, which also was smeared. This is a swastika from the temple. This is another picture from the United States, a swastika at the wall of a student fraternity house. I think it was in Michigan, if I get my details right off the top of my head. Now, why do I show you these pictures? It's a fascinating little detail here because this is a quick fast forward. The one on the right with the policeman at the Temple Emmanuel on Fifth Avenue was a Russian operative painting the swastika at the wall. The other one was, as far as we know, most likely a genuine anti-Semitic student. Now, basically, one is fake and one is factual, if you like. Now, clearly, it becomes a little bit of a mute question which one's fake and which one's factual. And indeed, it is extremely difficult to break down the numbers and say how many of the graffitis and other little incidents that happened were actually done by somebody who was doing it because they were paid or instigated to do so, as opposed to actually believed in it. I'll have more on that in just a moment. January 7th in the UK, just a picture from Leeds, just to show you how pervasive it was. And I could go on, but of course the image material is, some of this imagery, by the way, is super hard to track down. So I'll stop now with that. And of course, the reaction was intense. In Berlin, you had on January 8th, at the height of the campaign, you had a demonstration of approximately 40,000 people taking to the streets, demonstrating against neo-Nazi tendencies, against anti-Semitism in Germany. A day later, or a week later actually, demonstrations in London, huge demonstrations, 50,000 people, 50, take to the streets in London, march on the German embassy, and you have this rise of anti-German sentiment in the UK, in the US. The press coverage of the operation, I'm just giving you a few snippets here from Germany. These are all front pages, only front pages. From other countries, this is one from the UK of a newspaper that doesn't exist anymore, The Guardian. I think there were well more than 1,000 articles written only within the space of a few weeks on this incident. It was absolutely massive at the time. In Germany, the perspective on the operation was, I'll sum it up by saying, in Germany, the perspective was, this is only a few bad apples. Possibly very early on, some suspicions were articulated that this may be communist inspired, but the allegation didn't really fly. So in Germany, the perspective was that this is a problem that we basically have under control and will disappear if we tackle it in the right way. And Germany did a lot of things to tackle the rise of anti-Semitism, working with schools, working with teachers, etc. But outside Germany, the perspective, the perception was very different. This is a cartoon from the New York Times at the time, and you know the person on the right, this guy is Adenauer, the German chancellor, and what you see, and Germany is in the sick bed. And, you know, Germany really doesn't look very great here in that cartoon. So the reputational damage for the country, for West Germany, was absolutely massive. So the operation was extremely effective. I think it's beyond any doubt, considering the amount of press coverage it generated. And also just, I mean, you know, the Israeli Minister of Justice at the time, for example, spoke about it in front of the Knesset. The Bundestag and the German cabinet had special emergency meetings on this several times. I mean, it was a huge deal. So I'll speak about the attribution of the incident in now for a few minutes. But before I do so, just to give you a chance to throw a question at me or a comment. Any questions so far? Yes, sir.
Was there any signs of the behind the Iron Curtain, or was it just other signs?
I appreciate the question. It's a brilliant question. In fact, sorry, I repeat the question. The question is, was there any, if I heard right, the question was there any symptom or any sign of anti-Semitism of the same type of problem on the other side of the Iron Curtain, right? I forgot that detail. Thank you. The answer is almost none, except East Berlin. Berlin was a hotspot of this operation. And at the time, and this happens very early in January, anti-Semitic incidents begin appearing in East Berlin. And the authorities in East Berlin, obviously, these are, you know, communist. The wall isn't up yet in Berlin. This is 59. The wall gets built a good year later, in 61. So there's a lot of traffic, easy traffic between East and West Berlin. So essentially the problem backfires into East Berlin, and within the same time frame, we have approximately 220 anti-Semitic incidents in East Berlin as well, which of course the authorities tried to suppress. They didn't want to admit this because in their own ideology they were very much anti-fascist. So yeah, that is a fascinating detail. We only know this from archives that opened much, much later. At the time, it was difficult to assess. This was a great question. So is there another question like this? Okay, I'll move on. We have, there will be a little bit of time for Q&A. What you see here, the person you see here on this picture is Franz Josef Strauss. He was at the time the Bavarian Minister of Defense in Germany. And he was one of the first people to make public a report of the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the German Foreign Intelligence Agency, which was brand new at the time, still called Organisation Gehlen at the time. And the intelligence that he revealed first, and it was later revealed in more detail, was that in a meeting of the East German government, so the gentleman that you can see here on the right is Walter Ulbricht. He's the head of state, the chairman of the Socialist Party in East Germany. He, here in a conversation with Khrushchev, he chaired a meeting in January 1959, so approximately a year before the operation started, in which it was decided to try to instigate neo-Nazi hate crimes in Germany through covert operators. And they made that decision, obviously, in a confidential and a secret meeting, but Bundesnachrichtendienst revealed that detail about the meeting, which, you know, I think is a highly significant expression of intent. But then what happened next is interesting, because a lot of people in the press, and in fact inside the German government, said, and this may sound familiar, said, well, okay, we had that meeting, we had the anti-Semitic incidents that just happened But how do we know there's actually a connection between the two? Like, okay, we have an expression of intent, we have an incident that is a perfect fit, but then, of course, the next, prove it trap question is, but how do we know they're actually connected? Well, turns out they arrested approximately 320 people engaging in these incidents, but among those who were arrested at the very start of the operation, it was possible to show that they had contact with authorities in East Germany. So in the case of at least 4 people, we can trace some basically covert activity. 2 of them actually admitted having worked as an agent for the Ministry of State Security in East Berlin. So that link, again, was established a little later. By the way, just in quick brackets, from an investigator's point of view, I mean, I obviously have the internet and electronic search capabilities at my disposal today, but people at the time didn't have that. So I can today I can connect all the dots, all the different bits and pieces of evidence that appeared in different countries very easily. I mean, it still takes a bit of work, but it's kind of amazing that I can illuminate an incident that happened so long ago in more granularity today because of the internet. So I mean, just a small, fascinating development there. Another piece of evidence appeared. This, by the way, is a building. Is how GCHQ looked like before they moved into the donut. This is their headquarters building before the donut. So GCHQ, most likely GCHQ, the name did not appear in the press, revealed another piece of evidence at the time, which is highly significant. GCHQ revealed to 2 or 3 different newspapers at the time that they intercepted a piece of communication from Moscow to East Berlin that spelled out the operational rationale for instigating these hate crimes. Actually, 2 pieces of communication, one that spelled out the rationale and one that assessed its success. So we know from that leak that the Russian authorities considered the operation a very significant success already in early January. And that was still ongoing at the time. Interesting little technical detail. This is also a rare early example of a decrypted piece of intelligence getting leaked to the press, which happens, at least we don't know of that happening very often. A small detail of intelligence history. But that's not all. In contrast to today, almost all intelligence operations that we look at today, and some of you I'm sure will have done work on operations that later turned out to be some sort of intelligence operation, state-sponsored or private. We very rarely have the benefit of defectors, of people who leave the organization or defect from their agency and start talking about planning an operation and executing an operation. The benefit of hindsight in this case is that we have approximately 5 defector accounts, 5. Some of them are less useful than others, but that illuminate parts of the operation. So from those defector accounts, I was actually able to meet with 2 of the defectors who revealed information about this incident, which was an amazing, amazing experience to talk to these people. I mean, I remember one conversation where, anyway, this is a public event, I shouldn't relay private conversations. The Khrushchev, who you see on this picture, at the time at the UN, you can, before he famously used his shoe to bang on the table, but Khrushchev, in December '58, appointed this gentleman, Alexander Shelepin, if I'm pronouncing this correctly, as head of KGB. And Shelepin appointed this gentleman, General Ivan Agayants, as the head of the newly created disinformation department. So this is The operation that I described was the first major operation of the newly created disinformation department, which at that point in time was only operational for a couple of weeks, a couple of months. And their focus was East Berlin. They had 20 people stationed in East Berlin and approximately 50 people stationed in Moscow. And they were only doing disinformation and active measures campaigns. Agayans did something extraordinary, which we know from 2 defector accounts, and I think we can treat it as a credible anecdote around the operation. So Agayans, he was a very cultured man who spoke multiple languages. It was must have been a very impressive operator. He knew from a press report, from multiple press reports, earlier in 58, so 1 year before the operation started, there was an actual anti-Semitic incident in Germany where a school teacher had said something vile, racist in a beer hall and was then sentenced to 1 year in prison. So this is 1 year before the operation starts. And the entire affair with the school teacher, being an anti-Semite, was a huge press story, even in the English-speaking press. The Guardian covered it. He saw that and thought to himself, that is interesting. We can probably take advantage of this open wound in Germany, with the genocide in its immediate past. On a side note, he was Armenian, so he probably knew the significance of national trauma because of their own genocide. So Agayans said, okay, before we actually run this thing at a global scale, which of course is a significant risk for them as well, we need to test it. We need to do a test run, just like some operations today are tested in a test lab before. So he dispatched a small team of KGB people to a village outside Moscow, where they kicked over tombstones, sprayed, painted swastikas on walls, and then, disappeared, kept quiet, and watched how the village would react to this type of incident. And they found that most people were horrified and didn't like what's going on, but a few young people would join in. So they basically tested in Russia itself that this kind of instigation operation would work, and that is then exactly how they started executing the operation. I find, you have to almost respect him for his foresight here. So this is truly a daring move on his part to pull this off. Please don't tweet this picture. This is me meeting with one of the defectors who actually made that operation public. But I want to draw a few quick conclusions from this case to bring it to the present. Why is this an interesting case to study? And I left out a number of details that will be in the book. So let me just highlight a few bullet points that I think are significant for today. One is, remember those 2 swastikas? One was fake and one was real. I think we have the illusion today, because of our media environment, that the line between fake and real can be drawn quite easily. Think of the entire Facebook ad business, or falsified documents within the leaks. I think people have that, especially people with some better forensic training. We think we can very clearly draw the line between what is actually factual and correct and what is not. But I think this example shows that in practice, by design, and this is kind of difficult to get to terms with intellectually, by design these operations are blurring the line between fake and true. And that's not just a sort of academic thing. They blur the line because they create behavior, and I think we see this almost every day now. They create behavior that would not have happened otherwise. And you cannot say this is fake or real behavior. I mean, obviously it's real behavior, but you can't. The entire discussion about fake news and forgeries versus non-forgeries has a very different practical resonance, I think, if you come from a historical perspective. It's an illusion to think that we can draw a clear line here. The second point that I wanted to point out is about the value of forensic work in hindsight. I already mentioned this, that technology enabled me to tease out this story. I think this would have been very difficult for historians, who work with archives, paper boxes, and files only to get to this level of detail. So that, I think, is a new quality. Historians, I think, need some of the skills as well that you are discussing at this conference. Third quick point, which makes me very concerned, actually. I can go back and look at this operation in hindsight in extraordinary granular detail, even 50, 60 years after the fact. But we have a problem with archiving forensic information, detail, artifacts today. Just imagine for a moment, a historian 20 years from now, or 40 years from now, wants to go back and reconstruct the picture of an operation that is happening today. I suspect it will be much more difficult, probably impossible, to go back to the same granular picture that most of us can pull out today. So I think we really have a problem archiving operationally relevant information today. And I don't really know what the solution is. It's not just the Internet Archive or archive.is, but I would really encourage you to think about archiving for future generations. We need public record in order to agree on what the facts are, and not just today, but also in the future. Another difference to this case that I would quickly want to highlight is the nature of amplification has completely changed. There was no social media at the time. Almost the entire amplification of the operation was done by journalists. So in some ways, Agayans, who you can see again on this picture, General Agayans, and KGB was extremely effective in weaponizing journalists, in weaponizing the press against the West itself. Now, but they needed their tacit cooperation. They needed to trick them. Today, amplification on social media and on forums and whatnot has achieved an operational quality on its own. I think that is a new aspect. Another quick bullet point, defector accounts. I think I could not have told this story without defector accounts. Again, the evidence, even without defector accounts, without people talking about the operation from an inside perspective, the evidence was pretty good, but not perfect. We need defector accounts to really close the loop, to get a full picture. So that also will be very difficult to achieve, I think, as we move forward, because we don't have a Cold War context anymore that would motivate defectors to come forward. Finally, the speed of attribution here is fascinating. If you have a major successful operation like this, and I think we had one in 2016, as you know, the attribution needs to happen almost in real time to reach the full public, to reach its full impact. If you have high quality attribution 5 months later, that is just not going to make a big difference, which is why this operation was so successful. The attribution was pretty good, even at the time, but it came too late. And I think most people in Germany, even a few years later, just would have considered this wave of anti-Semitism a wave of anti-Semitism. In fact, Germany changed its basic criminal law, Strafgesetzbuch, as a result of the operation, which is extraordinary if you think about it as in terms of cause and effect. Finally, the evidence in this operation again will always get called into question, even very good evidence. When Strauss, the guy on the phone, when he articulated some findings, some intelligence findings, his political opposition party called them into question. The New York Times called it into question. The press in Germany did. So evidence, even if it's very good, will always get called into question. I think that's just also a sad fact of life. So just be ready for this. When the stakes politically are high enough, evidence will not speak for itself. You have to speak for it, and again, and again, and again. And finally, and this is the last point I want to make, and this is a provocation, I think, to some people here in this room. We run the risk sometimes today of talking ourselves into a forensic fit. What do I mean by forensic fit? I mean, think of the operation that Agajans planned there. Today, we have this basically today we can have a detailed conversation of the paint and its chemical components, if you like, that was used to paint a swastika. We can have a detailed conversation about the bus or the taxi that the operative took in order to get to the synagogue to paint the swastika. I'm using a metaphor, obviously. I'm talking about very detailed forensic conversations about technical specifics of operations that ultimately, I mean, they are important sometimes to do the attribution, but ultimately they're very down in the weeds, and we need to take a step back to put things into the larger perspective, as I was doing today sometimes. And the example that comes to mind is shadow brokers, and in a way, NotPetya. Shadow brokers weaponized the cybersecurity community in the same way Agajans weaponized journalists in the 1960s. Because by dumping this tool set, first on GitHub, whoever did this, they knew exactly that the cybersecurity community would take those exploits and tools and, sift through them and dig out the interesting parts and then make them public. And that part, the sifting through the evidence and discussing it publicly, that created the actual damage. That was the actual operational effect. So, obviously, it was also important and necessary to do that. And I'm not saying, they shouldn't have done that. But the discussion of an operation itself has become part of an operation. We have about 12 minutes left, so I'll stop here and take a few questions and try to answer them if I can. Thank you very much.